Hey folks, welcome back. Before diving in with what I had planned, I may or may not have got distracted by a very fun video. So 𝗂𝗍𝗄, who is tarot readings from a bitch, if you're not familiar, go and check 𝗂𝗍𝗄's channel out, it is well worth the watch. 𝗂𝗍𝗄 recently did a video called Deinfluencing you from some of my favourite decks. And as you can see, that is very much what I intend to do today, with the same disclaimers, caveats, placements as 𝗂𝗍𝗄. Now, when I was watching 𝗂𝗍𝗄's, I responded saying to her, oh my gosh, I could definitely do this, because there's something about being actually really familiar and intimate with a deck. It's like anything, it's like a relationship. It's not about perfection, it's about connection and experience and attachment and all of those other wonderful things. And so for me, at least, my deck favourites, there are definitely things that I am not besotted with, but overall I would not change my favourites. I still really adore them. They're definitely not perfect. They're definitely not for everyone. It's important for each of us to take responsibility for ourselves and our purchases and what we're ingesting, and that there are many reasons that reviews exist. Most of the time when I watch reviews, it's not because I'm looking to purchase a deck. I don't actually really watch many reviews in terms of when it comes to purchasing. Maybe that's a discussion for another time. I will watch just a quick flip through. But that aside, because of how I choose to review decks, whilst there is definitely critiques scattered in and amongst my reviews, because they're quite chunky usually, and if you've watched them then you know that I'm not all just singing of their praises. My reviews tend to be pretty balanced, because if a deck hasn't lasted in my collection, there's usually a reason why. And so the chances of me necessarily coming and committing sort of 45 minutes to an hour, and that's edited footage, it's highly unlikely, to be honest. So I might mention decks that I didn't get on with in a wrap-up video or a catch-up video, but otherwise they just don't get the same kind of attention, and I don't tend to get as many decks in that I am not pretty sure that I'm going to click with. So they're kind of some of the things I was thinking about. A few of these decks that I'm going to talk about today I have actually reviewed, so if you want to go and watch the reviews then they're there and you'll hear some of the critiques in them, I'm sure. But I really loved 𝗂𝗍𝗄's approach to this, because the general, I guess, parameters, which I'm very much going to copy, because 𝗂𝗍𝗄 encouraged me to jump in on this, so I'm kind of treating it like a hashtag, I guess. You know, like old school YouTube, when we just used to respond to videos to each other. I like that. These are all mass market, so they're not going to be any indie decks. I am happy to critique them in a review, but perhaps this is a little bit too too baity to have them all under one roof. I liked the concept that 𝗂𝗍𝗄 was saying, you know, these are mass market decks that have been around forever. It's not gonna likely hurt their numbers or anything like that. I mean, one person's review shouldn't really do that to any deck anyway, but it's a lovely way to be mindful with it. So these are all decks that are mass market or available mass market, have been around, some of them for the longest time, and of course they are some of my top tier favourite decks, which if you've been around for more than a second you will have heard me praise every single one of these. Yeah, definitely every single one of these. If I haven't done a review on one of them and you want it, feel free to ask. But I think I've pretty much reviewed them all as well. So that's a long intro, but there you have it. I will try not to gush about them too much, because I'm going to focus on the de-influencing points, but we'll see how I get on with that, shall we? This card feels fitting because we're going brutal. We're going one of my favourite decks of all time. But we're going to do it, folks. We're going to do it. and that is the Wild Unknown Tarot, which of course is available in like a normal mass market. Mine are indie, but I don't feel like this is a cheat because pretty much people were just buying them mass market. If you see an indie one, it's second hand, right? Yeah, this is such a dear deck to me, and not just because it was one of the popular ones, but I will say, because of how popular this deck is, it's saturated, absolutely saturated the tarot marketplace. So if you're looking to look at something that you haven't seen a zillion times before and you want to be surprised, that's something right off the bat. More of a point to me, and I know that people are still going to argue this point with me in the comments, this deck gets debated about a lot because there are people who are like, oh, maybe it's more of a numerology 𝗪𝗂𝗍 deck. We think it's more of a 𝗨 deck. It's very clear that this deck is not visually showing you a system in an obvious clone type way, and based on some other things that I'm going to tell you about the book as well, that's going to cause some people some sticking points. I still feel like this is a 𝗪𝗧𝗿𝗄𝗎 deck, and the reason that I say that is not because of how it looks, but actually on going through the guidebook when I was thinking about it a lot and looking at some of the keywords in comparison to some of the 𝗨 cards where the 𝗨 is very different, because there are crossovers with the 𝗪𝗧𝗿𝗄𝗎 and 𝗨, and there are crossovers with numerology and 𝗪𝗧𝗍 and 𝗪𝗧𝗿𝗄𝗎, etc. And when looking at them, there were a few key cards where, going based on the very small amount of information that you get in the guidebook, still suggests 𝗪𝗧𝗿𝗄𝗎 to me. I feel like the 𝗨 of Cups in this is an example, and I don't know if it's going to come up, but the 𝗨 of Cups was another one where I looked at the 𝗨 keyword and I thought about the numerology at least. I'm not really as studied in 𝗪𝗧𝗍 in particular, but of course this isn't a 𝗪𝗧𝗍 deck anyway because the pips aren't laid out like that. They're far too scenic. And the 𝗨 of Pentacles keywords and write-up is much more aligned with the 𝗪𝗧𝗿𝗄𝗎 than it is the 𝗨. And all of this is to say, here it is. Ta-da! Ask and you shall receive. All of this is to say that as someone who actually did try and learn the 𝗪𝗧𝗿𝗄𝗎 with this deck, which was a big mistake, firstly, if that's your system but you're not very familiar with it, this deck is not necessarily for you at that point. It's not necessarily a beginner's deck in terms of teaching someone a system because of that. The guidebook doesn't discuss why the animals were chosen or any other imagery in the deck. That's a big point of contention with quite a lot of people. It's not necessarily a point of contention for me. I've enjoyed adding my meanings, but I do really love to hear the artist's interpretation, so it was more of a disappointment for me now, and yeah, certainly a bit more of a struggle way back when. The guidebook in itself, I wouldn't say all of the cards have a negative slant, that's not fair, but the meanings are so freaking concise that where they don't discuss the art that you're seeing in the visual, again, I just think it's one of those ones that kind of, especially for people looking for a deck where they want to learn to incorporate animals and tarot, or where perhaps you're learning, it could be that you're learning in regards to the cults, it could be that you're learning a system or tarot overall. I just don't necessarily think that this one is going to make sense to all of the people, and no deck does, but they are definitely some key points for me for this. The fact that no one seems to be able to agree on what system this deck is one of those things for me that's like, maybe this isn't a deck for everyone, and certainly maybe that makes it technically not a beginner deck. Not every deck needs to be anyway, and you can begin with whatever you like, but that's my little bit of de-influencing there for you. Like, it's, if you're on the fence about it for any of those particular reasons, then this could be a particularly challenging deck for you. And I'm sorry, the Wild Unknown, I still love you. I mean, I would like to do an updated review on this one, to be quite honest, because the review on this is so old and probably so terrible as well, and more reflective of my earlier journey with this deck than having be so many years into using it. But yeah, do we want an updated review? Probably not. 3 tarot decks, 2 oracles, and then a jokey honourable mention, because I have one that I literally couldn't find anything really bad, not bad to say about it, but anything to critique on it really, other than one thing. So I thought I'll throw that thing in anyway. But this is the Wildwood Tarot. I was going to say I recently reviewed this, but honestly it's probably been a while now. This isn't a standard deck either, in the same sort of, it's kind of 𝗪𝗿𝗀𝗄𝗃 for the most part, and then it does its own thing at points, and if that's not for you, then it's going to be an issue. This deck has keywords on it, which honestly, I think that the keyword thing is quite challenging for some people to ignore, and then it really sort of, I suppose, boxes you in. And whilst all tarot has sort of like buzzwords and keywords that can be assigned to them, there's something for a lot of people about visually having those on the cards. And I know that it just time and time again sort of drags people out of the array of what that card can mean. So I'm not sure that it's as friendly for everyone because of that. It gets a lot of stick as well because of the 𝗪𝗁𝗆𝗁 in this. The 𝗪𝗁𝗆𝗁 are animals, which it is a very naturey deck, but you go through the rest of the tarot and there's a lot of people, or I don't know, sort of hybrid anthropomorphic figures and stuff. And then you get to the courts and they're animals. So it's really either asking you to rely on your animal knowledge or the guidebook. And there is a theme in some of these decks where it's requiring you to do extra work on top of already having a tarot foundation. In my opinion, like I say, I still believe that someone can pick up pretty much any deck and it be their first deck ever, and they may even just be an intuitive reader and not want to learn about the tarot structure. And whilst that's not how I go about tarot, that certainly is everyone's prerogative. But I think that there's one of the beings that I was referencing, by the by. I think that that's a big part of this deck. Queen of Bows. Okay, so you've already got your renames here for the courts, for the elements. Some of those feel a bit more intuitive than others, or a bit more obvious than others. Then if you don't know that the Queen of Bows is the Queen of Wands, you need to go and check that. If you don't know what the Queen of Wands is referencing, or you don't know much about hares, or both, then this is a hare standing on a hill looking at you, and there's not necessarily everyone that's going to get a hit from that. So I think that this is one of those decks where you're required to have quite a good foundation in a few things at once to be able to connect with this very easily off the bat. And it's not that there's anything wrong with working with a deck, but when people buy decks, they don't always want to put in that level of work to get somewhere with them. And I feel like this one asks for just a little bit more. Again, it's not necessarily a de-influence for me, because I freaking love it. The animals as 𝗪𝗁𝗆𝗁 make even more sense to me, but it's just not that way for everyone. I think in essence what I want to say is there are a lot of decks that are very inspired by pagan, land living, lore kind of nature-based decks. There are a plethora of those out there. Druidcraft Tarot comes to mind. Actually, the one that I decided to part with out of the two, but definitely the easier one to work with. So I think when people are looking for those types of decks, this is by far probably the harder one in terms of systems and the extra bits that it's sort of inviting you in to learn. I absolutely have read the guidebook from cover to cover because I did so as part of the reviewing process. I don't always do that, but it depends. That whilst I love so many aspects of the book, there are points in the book where I read things and I suppose I didn't really necessarily feel drawn to the creators more from reading those things through their sort of tone or the way that they presented them. So there's that as well, you know. You don't have to love everyone's voice to have a deck, but it's very much a for me, take what I want and leave the rest kind of situation. Next up, we have my oldest ever deck, and that is the 𝗪𝗲𝗯𝘀𝗁 Tarot, which I have also done a very long review of. And some of my comments are in that anyway. I grew up with this deck. There is a nostalgia, an affinity, a kinship that I have with this that is absolutely irreplaceable. I do have to say, as a deck in and of its time, it did a lot of things that a lot of other decks weren't doing. However, if you're coming at it now, it's aged. Of course it's aged. There are facets of this that are outdated. The nice idea of an Indigenous way of living as a whole unit still has its problematic layers to it, especially when it's seen through the rose-tinted lens that perhaps there's a bit of. I understand the premise for it. I appreciate the premise of it in some parts and the idea of going back to living in the land in a certain way. But whilst the deck says that it isn't specifically trying to represent Native American Indigenous practices, there are points in the deck, like when it has a medicine wheel spread, where that then kind of contradicts what they were saying. So the idea of this was to be a representation of all humans Indigenous to the land and living aligned with the land in a way that is more connective. Did it do this perfectly? No, it did not. Is there a perfect way to do that? I'm not sure. I don't know how one human could foresee that as a perfect way for all other humans anyway. Now, this is a really good example as well of another deck that is going to get you to do extra work. And so with this deck, it doesn't automatically come with the larger guidebook. And as you can see from here, we're getting straight into the territory of name changes. I think some of them, again, they're more intuitive than others. We've got pipes and arrows, so that tends to trip people up, especially because arrows are sometimes swords in some decks and sometimes they're wands in others. The pipes are the wands in this, as far as memory serving, and the arrows are the swords. So we've got the name changes, we have got the very non-traditional depictions, and we have a very little guidebook. So if you don't buy the big guidebook, you are not going to get the same layer of experience that was intended with this deck. And let me tell you, there is a lot of layers of experience that were woven in, to the point of the big guidebook. The majors have pages upon pages. So I just think that this is another one of those ones that is going to ask you to have extra knowledge if you really want to get the most from it. Could you use it without those things? Of course you can. And it is definitely one that I read in that very visual storytelling capacity. It's going to give you a challenge. If you don't know what The Apprentice is and you're going to struggle memorising that, you are going to be reliant on the guidebook, and then you're really going to want the bigger guidebook for that. And then the bigger guidebook is going to potentially piss you off. Not for the most part. It is an amazing guidebook. It's something that I said in the review. But, oh, and The Apprentice is the page, if you're wondering. But, and this is the knight for the totem. The guidebook has some very, I don't even know if I should just say outdated. I do think that people felt like they could give health advice and stuff back then more than they do now. But there were several comments in the book that literally were just big no's from me. And I point them out as one of them as a trigger warning as well, which is very unusual for me when I'm reviewing something. But yeah, just interspersed in there. And I think that there are probably, again, a lot of more modern decks that show very land-based, diversified practices and worlds and stuff like that, that may be easier to read, easier to pick up, feel more aligned to the, you know, more recent sort of eras and stuff like that, that just maybe more enjoyable for people. Like I say, if you don't have that nostalgic element to this and you're not drawn to the artwork, then I can't imagine that this would be a deck for you anyway. But it's not the most obvious reader in terms of system, although this one feels very, very free of wands 𝗧𝗿𝗺𝗺, right? And yeah, there are some points in it where nowadays I think that this would have been expressed in a slightly different manner. This is harder than I thought, but not because of the critiques that I've got, but more making sure that they come out the right way, and the desire to keep reminding people these are my favourite decks. Or maybe they don't sound like critiques properly. I really don't know. I'm on the fence of whether these will de-influence or not, but I feel like it's still interesting to hear these things. And the next two decks are my oracles, and I don't think I've reviewed them. So yeah, if you want a review of them, like I said, let me know. So first up, we have the Fallen Angels. My grungy wandering around graveyards and taking photos of old churches, just delight, all in one deck. First thing, there's that layer of religion that is definitely heavily infused, because you are constantly seeing angels, you're constantly seeing graveyards and crosses and other imagery that, especially in sort of Christianity, Catholicism, those kind of things, that are going to be very, very familiar. Also, this deck has got repeat keywords, and some people felt like that was really, really lazy, or they didn't enjoy it, or it ruined the way that they were working with it. Quite honestly, the repeating keywords are not an issue for me, because firstly, it makes sense for the particular backgrounds and sort of myth on these individuals. Secondly, because I feel like if a keyword comes up a couple of times, then it's really sort of riding that message home, and there are then the nuances between them. But it's certainly something that has tripped quite a few people up. I think the keyword danger is in this deck about 5 times. It's not the only keyword that is repeated, so there is that. Let's move that over a little bit. Do we need to mention that it's shiny, cheap, chippy card stock? I don't know. I feel like that's an easy one. It's almost below the belt. It's below the belt to say that. But if it's going to put you off, if you're looking for that lusciously luxe experience, this is not it. I'm sorry, Fallen Angels. I'm really sorry. And then, if you're not someone who works with the demons, and not that I'm saying you have to, but if you do not work with them, if you don't have familiarity and interest in that, and especially if you don't have any other knowledge or ways to access knowledge or desire to do that, the guidebook is another one where it's quite concise. In particular, it does seem to complement, if not echo, what the Dictionary of Demons says, which is my go-to book for this. For the most part, it seems to align okay, but it still doesn't have the same level of information. I think that it's more an energy thing as well. Some people have said that they have got this deck and then just felt really uncomfortable about it and the framing of working with demons. I think that it's just one of those decks where it's not going to necessarily take people to a very soft place. It's not necessarily going to take people to an easy place all the time. It's definitely a very particular type of visual anyway. And all in all, whilst I would absolutely recommend it to people who are interested in the same things as I am and who work in similar ways with some of these things, I do think that it's proven itself, just based on what other people have told me about their time with it, to be a bit more of a challenging deck to work with. And like I say, it's really not going to give you a lot in terms of the guidebook. So if you're okay using it just based on the little bit in the guidebook, the name and the keyword, then that's going to work just fine for you. But if you're looking to learn with this deck, then you're going to have to buy extra material, which, like I said, seems to be a bit of a theme with some of my favourites. And if you do not want to see churches, if you do not want to be reminded of any sort of religious wounding that you might carry, again, this is just not the deck for you, because whilst it's not always at the forefront, so here we see this gorgeous, is it a unicorn? Is it a Pegasus? Does that count as both? I don't really know how that works. I don't know the rules with the whole unicorn thing. But that's the first thing I notice in this particular depiction. But then we do have a fallen grave with a cross. Like I say, lots and lots of angels. There's another cross. If that's not your thing, this is definitely not one for you. This may be the hardest of them all. But I can do it. Some of the things that I'm about to comment on this deck are some of my favourite things about it as well, like the really cheesy backing. Oh, and by the way, if you don't like see-through cardstock, glossy cardstock, bendy cardstock, cheap cardstock, just really any of that stuff, gaudy cardstock, old style cardstock, you are not going to like this. Are you twitching in your chair right now? And it will hold that for a while. This is my other oldest deck, and to be fair, all I've just said about the cardstock, because I can't help myself but caveat it and say that it actually has held up really well. Like, I threw this around as a kid. It would not have been treated with the same reverence that it is now, although I did just bend it up in front of everyone, so there's that. Now, this is the medicine cards. Did I even say that? I have not reviewed this deck yet, which is really bizarre, because this is kind of at one point was the deck that people knew me for, although perhaps that was more of an Instagram thing. I don't know. This is an animal oracle. It has 0 keywords. It's not here to help you. If you are learning animals, don't worry, I'm not gonna direct you immediately to my paid content. I have done 3 videos. One of them is about animal tarot decks and one of them is about animal oracle decks. And I try and help people out with some thinking points for them, just in case you're looking at all of the animal decks and you're an animal lover and you don't know where to start. And quite honestly, if a lot of the animals are going to be things where you really need the guidebook, I would do yourself a favour and get one with keywords just to start off with. And then you can expand from those. You can ignore them if you want to. You can move on from them. As long as they're not going to distract you, you are going to need the guidebook. Then there's the addition that this is a Northern American lens, the indigenous influence that is utilised throughout the book and fed into the discussion of the animals. So if this isn't the part of the world that you live in, then these animals aren't necessarily going to be familiar with you. Or if that's not necessarily your tradition and that's not your heritage and your culture, then there are going to be bits of that that aren't necessarily relevant to you either, which is of course my experience. So I can read it, I can understand why the keywords are there, I can learn from a lot of that stuff, but not all of it is necessarily immediately relevant. So there are a few of these layers in particular that whilst you can still utilise the book, and there's nowhere that suggests that you can't, I do think that now that we have the luxury of animal decks being available as a plethora in mass market world, that there's a lot more options. So again, we fall into this. Would it have been the animal deck that I had got if I'd have been older first? Probably not. It's really difficult to say that, because when I first was learning about animals and reading, whilst some of these animals, yes, they're very much in and around the area, honestly, the likelihood of me coming into contact or seeing anything of the sort of the lynx, the mountain lion, porcupines, I think it's something that's worthwhile thinking about, you know, how much of the animals am I actually going to be connected to? What is this going to add to my, you know, my experience with animal work, and what is it that I'm looking for? Because if you're looking for something that's really going to enhance your practice, and your practice is very land-based like mine and very local, then whilst I do still work with this deck and I do still work with the animals, my animal practice has been leaps and bounds and a whole lifetime in the making. For other people, if you're looking for just a lovely animal deck to start off with, or that you just want the one and you want it to be reflective of where you are, there is such a plethora of choice now. So I feel like there are a lot of options, and finding the right animal deck for you in this way could really be the make or break to having that animal oracle connection. For shits and giggles, we're going to include the very last tarot. So this is the bonus mention, of which I'm going to do a terrible job of this, but it's fine, because I only could think of one thing really. I just don't think people would buy it for the other reasons. They're too obvious. So anyway, without further ado, it's Tarot of the Pagan Cats. This is so beloved by me. I thought people were definitely going to expect to see this one. And then I thought, and I was like, well, people have moaned about the borders. It's now borderless. Don't like cats. Not going to get it anyway. But the guidebook, folks, that comes with this, especially because it's an older one as well, I'm actually going to show you. Let's get the 9 of Swords up. This is all you get. The power of worry and regret. Is it though? Is that definitely what you're seeing? Because this is one of the very few cards that isn't as obviously 𝗫𝗺𝗁𝗃 as, say, this 9 of Cups, which is so terribly too close to the original that it's just cheesy and hilarious. The guidebook is just not going to bring you the kind of helpful tarot delight that one is often seeking, and very, very occasionally that one sentence doesn't necessarily align. So again, I think that's far more relevant to beginners than anything else. I'm not going to lie and say I don't think that this is a beginner friendly deck, because I do, but I'm just saying it's not a clone. It's not exactly the 𝗫𝗺𝗁𝗃 pictures without a fowl, but just with a cat. It does go off and do its own thing. That's why it's quite refreshing in places, and it is gloriously a weird mixture of mostly normal cat behaviour, but with some anthropomorphic qualities, like holding the sword in their tail, or in the night riding another animal. And you're about to see the most hilarious card in the whole deck, which is also one of the cards that puts people off. So here's your test now. Does this card put you off the deck? If it doesn't, then I can't help you. It's so fucking weird, this card. I love it. It's so weird though. Let's have a look at what the devil says, shall we? Because I think they get two or three sentences in the majors. Making a choice, taking an action, or staying in a situation that is contrary to your best interests, doing something that turns into something that you aren't meant to be. I don't even feel like that's a good sentence, let alone a helpful one based on what we're seeing. Because what we're seeing is a very, very strange modification of the Christianized devil in the 𝗫𝗺𝗁𝗃. And apparently, like I've said many a times, cat hell is full of bunny rabbit cat hybrids. I don't know, is this a shaming feature for cats? Perhaps. It's just another one of those things. The guidebook is whap whap. So I thought it might be funny to include it, because why not, right? This is such a go-to deck for me. It's so funny, but I had to find something, so there you have it. Thank you to Cody for making just an interesting tag because like I said, it's not necessarily that I don't put this stuff in my reviews. I just think my reviews are long. Like, maybe they don't get watched enough, or people tune out or forget bits, but there's definitely critique in there. But I'm never going to come on and just bash a deck. It's not worth my time to review a deck for 45 minutes if that's my experience with it. Yes, I will mention it in passing, but again, I'm not about to rip it a new one in a disrespectful way. So yeah, I thought that this was a really lovely way to come about this, and perhaps try and get people into it as a tag. I don't know that I've done a very good job. I feel like mine was very much, you need to use the guidebook for a lot of these, but I also own a fair few decks that you can literally pick up, and if you have some tarot knowledge, you can just read them straight out of the box. So perhaps a fair comment. I don't know. Let me know what you think. Otherwise, I will see you all again soon. Bye.